It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Stan, and everyone who organized this conference. I really enjoy being with people who are interested in improving mental health services, and look forward to this day of discussions. So I was asked to talk about motivation and learning, and also a bit about the program that I developed. See if we work. I'm going to be referencing lots of people's work, but also want to mention some of the people I collaborate with and show you a picture of where I work. I come from, I'm in New York City, and that green building is where my office is, which is, it is indeed a concrete jungle there. Let's first acknowledge that really what we're all here for is to help people improve their daily lives. They often come to us complaining of particular symptoms, but the reason that they're upset about these symptoms is because it's getting in the way of them doing things that really matter to them, whether that's work or school or living independently or socializing. So there's been a lot of research trying to understand why is it that people have so much difficulty functioning in everyday life when they have severe and persistent mental illness. And so many of the illnesses cause cognitive impairment, and that's been identified as one of the big reasons why it's so hard to function. And it was sort of that, although certainly researchers in schizophrenia have since the beginning identified that cognition is a hallmark of the illness, it was as if people sort of rediscovered how disabling it is to have cognitive impairment. And there started to be a tremendous amount of interest in figuring out what could we do to address cognitive impairment. Let's see if I get the hang of this thing. So I would say that, initially the researchers said, well, look, people have cognitive impairment. What we need to do is address it. Their cognition's going to improve and their functioning will improve. And I call this the linear assumption. And the problem with that assumption is that it's not just cognition that gets in the way of functioning. There are other symptoms too. And one of the prevalent symptoms in major psychiatric illness is motivation problems. Most of the severe and persistent mental illnesses are associated with difficulties with motivation. And it turns out that motivation and cognition are very interrelated. They influence each other. If you have difficulty with cognition, it's going to be hard to be motivated because you may not keep your goal in mind, or you may have difficulty remembering the steps to reach your goals. And if you have difficulty with motivation, it's going to be it will be hard to initiate cognitive activities or sustain them. I think this slide shows very well how motivation and cognition can interact. What you see here is a study where they measured the degree of motivation impairment and the degree of difficulty with effort. And they also gave people cognitive testing. And the bars in red are those people who have motivational impairment and difficulty exerting effort. And you can see how much worse they do than those people that don't have those difficulties. I don't know if I can get this. Well, I'm not very good with pointers. So the far left is the global cognition. And you can see the significant difference between those who have motivational impairments and those who don't. So people started to realize, I guess motivation is important. We probably do need to think about it as we're addressing cognition. And I'd say that the bulk of researchers in cognitive remediation then resorted to what I would call the classical models of motivation. And in those classical models, They were thinking about motivating people with external factors, things like rewarding people for attending cognitive remediation by giving them money, or exerting authority and saying, please participate in this, and it was a fixed menu, so everyone was told exactly what to do when they attended the sessions. So both of those are examples of ways to motivate people to do things. There's nothing wrong with doing that. However, it doesn't necessarily prepare you for learning and for everyday life, because in everyday life, we actually have a lot of choices. For example, we can choose who our therapist is or what kind of learning activity we participate in. In fact, there are books written to tell us how to go about making those choices. And also, we don't usually get paid to go to therapy. And we don't usually get paid to go to school. Quite the opposite. We usually have to pay for therapy, or we usually have to pay to go to school. So when we use those very classic models, we're not necessarily preparing people for the everyday life situations. Also, when people feel controlled in learning environments, and giving people money is a way of controlling them. If I say to you, come to cognitive remediation, and every time you come, I will pay you, I'm exerting some control over you, right? And if I say to you, you need to do this in this order, I'm also controlling you. And there's evidence from work with people with non-psychiatric populations that when they learn in controlling environments, they actually lose their interest in learning as soon as the controls disappear. Furthermore, they often learn less. Okay? So we know that happens in mainstream education and with non-psychiatric populations. But there's also evidence that happens for people with psychiatric disorders. So some years ago, I was involved in a large multi-site study where people were getting lorazepam. They were looking at the combined effects of lorazepam and cognitive remediation. And that study was published. And I'm going to just be telling you about unpublished data right now. Halfway through the study, there was concern because they were having difficulty recruiting and keeping people in the study. And so they said, well, we'll start paying people to attend cognitive remediation sessions. Well, you can imagine I wasn't too thrilled about that personally, but I did see this as an opportunity because now we could compare the people who weren't paid to the people who were paid. And it was interesting because what we found was that, in fact, there was no difference in completion rates between those who were paid and those who weren't. So it actually didn't help to keep people in the study, all right? And just like in the non-psychiatric populations, the amount of change on cognitive scores declined in the paid people. So it didn't help to improve their learning. So there's been a tremendous amount of interest in motivation, looking at it as a reflection of people's internal values, looking at motivation as a reflection of the initiation and sustaining of behavior that reflects their values and reflects autonomous volition. And I put up here just a couple of pictures of books that are written, and these are books mainly about motivation and learning. There are hundreds of them. All you have to do is Google motivation and learning, and you'll have an opportunity to look at many, many book titles. It's an area of tremendous interest. It's also an area of interest within psychiatry. And there was fairly recently a study of articles about motivation in schizophrenia, which I thought was very interesting. They looked at the number of articles that have been written about motivation and schizophrenia since 1956, between 1956 and 2017. And you can see that there's a big increase in the number of articles being written about motivation and schizophrenia. It's a topic that's capturing people's attention. Also, they looked at what terms are people using when they talk about motivation and schizophrenia. And I just highlighted two of the areas. R&R stands for reward and reinforcement, and that's still the dominant area of interest. In schizophrenia research, when people talk about motivation, the bulk of the work is still about rewards and reinforcement. However, there's also been an increase of interest in IM, which is intrinsic motivation. That's that motivation to do things because it matters to you. It's something you value. It's the motivation because you're autonomously choosing to do it. So that's also increased over the years. Within the field of education, there's been a tremendous shift in the last 100 years about our thinking of how people learn. And you heard that I'm a Montessori teacher, so I originally had training in the field of education, and it's something that I continue to follow and have a lot of interest in. So the old model of how people learn is that we learn simply as the result of an interaction between our aptitude and the instruction. If you have greater aptitude, you learn more. That's how the Binet IQ test came about in the first place, as they were so interested to figure out how are we going to get people to learn more, and they were classifying them. But then they discovered, as everybody in this room I'm sure can attest, that aptitude isn't the only thing. We can all think of somebody who has tremendous aptitude and wasn't doing too well in school, right? And the reason for that is because it isn't just aptitude and instruction, it's also motivation. And now we understand that there's this reciprocal interaction between our motivation, our aptitude, and the instruction. And I might also add, it isn't just the student's motivation, it's the teacher's motivation as well. Of course, that gets into the instruction. So what does that mean for people who are doing cognitive remediation? What it means is that we don't want to simply be thinking about the actual exercise that we're doing, okay? It means that if you're trying to, whatever cognitive skill you're trying to improve, you don't want to only be thinking about the actual exercise. You also want to be thinking about the learning environment, and you want to be thinking about how that environment can be promoting that reciprocal interaction between motivation and aptitude and instruction. So, after all, cognition and cognitive therapies and cognitive remediation is ultimately intended to improve people's functioning. And so it's a recovery-oriented treatment, okay? And as such, it involves sharing with the person hope that they can improve, empowering them to be good learners, and it involves sharing with the person in the therapeutic process, listening to them, what do they think is important, okay, as we would with any recovery-oriented treatment. Cognitive remediation is strengths-based, like all recovery-oriented treatments, okay? We try to focus on what it is that will enable somebody to be socially integrated to the best of their capacity. And a goal of all recovery-oriented therapies is to promote autonomous learning. So what exactly is autonomous learning? You could define autonomous learning as the understanding and endorsing of learning objectives. So it doesn't mean that somebody walks into a cognitive remediation session and does whatever they want, okay? And it doesn't mean that they walk into a session and get no guidance. What it does mean is that they value learning, and it means that they're willingly engaging in a learning opportunity. It also means that they have interest in the learning activities. I think it's interesting that learning independently is different from autonomous learning. And why is that? Because with autonomous learning, you actually can be dependent, right? You can be autonomously dependent. If you know that you have difficulty with auditory processing, you might want some help with note-taking in a lecture, okay? You have willingly chosen, you value going to the lecture, and you're willingly being somewhat dependent on a person to help you, okay? So learning independently is different from autonomous learning. There's a professor by the name of Brett Jones, who's an educational psychologist, and he has taken a lot of the work from motivational theories and tried to put it into a model that's very easily understood by people who are engaged in teaching. And he calls it the music model, and I'm going to spend some time talking about it because I think it's a very useful and easy way to think about some of the most important aspects of motivation that we need to think about. So the music model, music is an acronym, and you can see here what it stands for. The intent is to put motivating strategies into 5 different categories. The general idea is that, for example, somebody leading a cognitive remediation group doesn't have to be an expert in motivation theory, okay? You don't have to have read all the papers. But if you can just remember the music model and then the acronym music, it will help you be a better instructor. The goal is to enable this cognitive remediation specialist or the teacher to be able to design learning activities that are motivating and to be able to diagnose what is motivating and demotivating for any particular participant. So if you are running a cognitive remediation group and using the music model, you would want to ensure that your participants feel empowered. That's what the M is for, that they feel empowered, which means they have some control over an aspect of the learning experience. Okay? You also want to ensure that they understand why they're there and how it might be useful to participate in that activity. The S is for success, and that refers to the importance of somebody believing that if they put effort into this activity, they will be successful. The I refers to interest, and that would mean that the person should be interested in the particular learning activity. And the C stands for caring, which are those interpersonal aspects that are motivating, that the person believes that the coach, the teacher, the therapist, and the other people in the group care about them as an individual, as somebody who matters. The idea is that the person leading the cognitive remediation group creates a motivating learning environment. The participants perceive that, okay? And then they become more engaged and focused and curious, and they actually learn more, and others around them perceive that this has been a positive and successful learning experience. Fairly recently, we collaborated with Brett Jones to take his inventory. It's called the Music Inventory. It's a questionnaire that you give to participants in a learning experience, and he developed it for mainstream education purposes. And we took this and adapted it for use in cognitive remediation. And this was a multinational project. People who were running randomized controlled trials with people who had schizophrenia and doing cognitive remediation participated, and they had their participants complete the inventory. So we were able to show that it's a valid and reliable inventory, but we also were able to show that the people who rated their learning environment as more motivating also attended the sessions with greater intensity. Okay, so they were voting with their feet and showing more engagement, which is what you would hope to find, right? So there are lots of things that we can do to create a learning environment that promotes autonomous learning. And I've put some of them up here, and I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I'll just highlight a couple. One thing is that when we engage somebody in cognitive remediation, that start with some shared decision making about what the focus of learning should be and how it relates to things that are important in them and in their lives, and how it will relate to things that they value. Of course, one of the things that is extremely important is that you offer choices, and that would be meaningful choices, okay? So as opposed to bringing somebody into a learning environment and telling them exactly what they have to do when, you would want to offer them opportunities to make some choice, okay? That's how we start to feel control. And another thing to do is when you are requiring certain behaviors of them, that you provide a rationale for that. So I can't go through all of these, but these are some examples of ways to promote autonomous learning. Learning environments can also promote an expectation of success, okay? And that's from the music model, that S stands for success. And how do we do that? One of the most important ways to do that is by making sure that you have set the difficulty level to be appropriate for the person. Now, lots of people nowadays are using web-based programs to provide the cognitive exercises, and the web-based programs are keenly aware of the importance of the perception of being able to succeed, and they usually set the difficulty level at about 80%. But a good therapist would be mindful that not everybody responds to 80%, for example. Some people actually are so tentative about entering into a learning situation that they need 90% or they're going to walk out of the room, okay? So a good therapist is going to be very thoughtful about providing exercises that are challenging to the person, but also where they can succeed. Another example of a way to promote expectations of success are to titrate the goal properties of the exercises. And by goal properties, if you think about it, that's like a short or a distal goal property. If I ask you to write a paper about the monarchy in England over the last 500 years and to hand it in a year, that's a very distal task, okay, which would be quite different from if I asked you to write about one specific monarch in a very short time period and to hand it in 2 weeks, okay? So those are examples of ways where you can actually titrate someone's expectations of success. The more distal a goal is, it's going to be harder for someone to actually gauge how successful they'll be. There's lots and lots of literature showing about the importance of people's perceived competency, whether they think they will be successful in a task. And it influences the learning activities they choose to be involved in, because nobody likes to fail, right? It influences how much effort people put on task. It influences how long they persist on learning activities. And it actually influences how much they achieve, how much they learn. There's been lots of research on that with children and with students of all ages, but there's also been research on that with people who are involved in cognitive remediation. One of the things that we want to do when we're working with people in recovery-oriented models is to break that vicious cycle that can happen. So a lot of these illnesses, like psychotic illnesses, are really hitting people hard, 18 to 23 years old, when they're out there really developing competencies as an independent person, okay? Those might be things they value, but the illness is causing them to withdraw and not to initiate behaviors. And so they are not developing the competencies they need. And of course, by not developing the competencies they need, they start to expect that they're going to fail. And that expectation of failure just feeds into the motivational deficits and causes them to withdraw even more. How many of you have seen that cycle? You're shaking your heads, yes. So we see that in cognitive remediation. We see that in most recovery-oriented programs where we're working with people. Perceived competency is extremely important to engagement. So in one study, we found that expectation of success was associated actually with treatment intensity, how often people were coming. That's the baseline, their baseline expectation of success. And in another lab, they found that baseline expectations of success predicted the persistence of learning on tasks at 3-month follow-up. And that was even after accounting for variance that was attributable to other factors, like baseline ability, attention, and self-reports of other aspects of motivation, like value and interest. So perceived competency is something you should be very aware of when you're working with people. But the value we assign to learning is also quite important. And there are different ways we value things. I'm just going to mention 2. In the music model, they only highlight 2 ways we value things. One is how useful it is, and the other is how interesting it is. Interesting tasks are typically more enjoyable, and useful tasks are things that we engage in because we think it will get us to a point we want to a point we value, all right? So there's certainly evidence to support that the way we value activities is important to learning in a cognitive remediation environment. So in one study, I have the one study I recently completed, we're just writing up this data. We found that the value scale on the intrinsic motivation inventory was a predictor actually of the amount of cognitive change people made after cognitive remediation. In another study, we found that people who saw tasks as more useful attended sessions with greater frequency. This seems sort of intuitive, right? It makes sense, okay? In that multi-site trial that combined cognitive remediation with lorazepam, they found that across the study randomization groups, the people who completed had more positive change in the way they valued the task as interesting and enjoyable, whereas the non-completers, their interest in the task declined. And the study by Bryce highlights the importance of value for both engagement and cognitive change. Baseline reports of perceived program value were the only significant multivariable predictor of session attendance when including global cognition and psychiatric symptomatology. And they also saw that the odds of cognitive improvement were increased when there was an increase in the way people valued the task. What about that last part of the music model, the C for caring? That is referring to how we get motivated through relating to others, okay? So the idea is that a learning environment would support relatedness by making people feel connected to others and by providing an environment where each person feels that they matter, okay, and that they belong. There are many ways you can do that. I've listed some of them here. And there's also evidence to support the value of creating relatedness in a learning environment. Some of that comes from Till's lab, and I've divided it here into relatedness from the therapist and also from peers. Okay, and Till alluded to that. She presented some of this data in her talk. Therapeutic alliance was significantly associated with both cognitive and functional gains. And in Huddy's study, they found that even after controlling for depression, clients who rated the alliance more favorably stayed in cognitive remediation longer, and they also were more likely to make gains in at least one of their cognitive areas. But the peers also matter. There's a study that actually compared what happens when someone works with a peer versus alone, and they found that those people working with peers had more cognitive gains. And then there's a favorite quote of mine when I sometimes will go into cognitive remediation sessions and just talk to people and ask them how it's going. I asked this one person, why do you come here, and what is it that you like about it? And she said, well, I come here for the people, the socializing. So if you take these, see if we can move this forward. If you take, put all of this together, it means that when we design cognitive remediation programs, we want to be incorporating these elements that we know are so important to motivate somebody. That means that we want to be designing programs where people have some autonomy, where they have a choice, where they can willingly engage in the activities. We want to make sure that they're valuing learning in the many different ways that one can value, okay? That they feel like they'll be successful and competent if they put forth the effort, and that the social interactions that are involved are rewarding. So I was also asked to speak about the NEAR program, which is a program that I developed and used. And so I'm going to spend some time doing that. I started working on this in the 1980s when somebody called me up and said, Alice, it turns out that people with schizophrenia have cognitive problems and we need to do something about it. And I said, well, I'm a neuropsychologist. I was just taught how to test for it. I don't really know much about doing anything about it. And they said, well, why don't you figure it out? So that's where we started. And of course, that's where my Montessori training proved to be invaluable. So in the 1980s, I started to figure out how exactly can we address these cognitive problems. And basically, I started to set up cognitive remediation, sort of like a Montessori classroom, which is what I was familiar with. Then in the 1990s, we spent quite a bit of time trying this out in various settings. And then in the 2000s, started to bring it to other countries and other languages. In the 2010s, I've been working quite a bit to develop train-the-trainer models and to provide tools to make it easy for people to do this. And now a lot of my work is with learning healthcare systems and more broadly in the area of cognitive health. There's a manual, and I guess I get royalties, so I have to disclose that. So there's a manual to help people who want to set up a program. The basic idea is that cognitive remediation is a learning activity and that motivation interacts with neuroplasticity and instructional techniques to impact learning. Just like a Montessori classroom, and I guess the next one is a picture, it's a group. people come in and there are a group of people, but everybody is working on their own task. Okay, so it's highly personalized that way. And the instructor moves around and helps people one at a time, all right, whoever needs help. The goal is that people are as autonomous as possible. Because it is set up with rolling admission, one person may have been there for 12 sessions, another might have been there for 20 sessions, and another might have just started that day. And that gives wonderful opportunities for peer leadership, which is a very strong component of the program. So in every session, people spend time working on the computer to do exercises that they and the therapist together have decided would be important to improve cognition so they can reach their goals. And then some of the session is spent actually as a group in a discussion. And it's called a bridging discussion because it bridges what people are doing on their own to everyday life. That the idea is to really help generalize cognitive gains to everyday life. It's set up to be with about 6 to 8 people and 1 clinician. The general treatment principles are to create a positive learning experience. It's a highly strengths-based program. People are learning how to use their cognitive strengths and to also improve their weaknesses. We obviously are very interested in promoting autonomous learning, awareness about learning, and awareness about cognition. Typical components of the program are some assessment, goal setting in the context of recovery goals, personalized treatment, and then people attend groups. And program evaluation is a very big part of it. This has been used in all kinds of settings in many countries, and it is designed for people over the age of 13 and people whose IQ is over 70. And it's really designed for people who are not able to improve their cognitive skills with less intensive methods. A lot of times I get phone calls, I want to do NEAR, what's the computer program, could you send it to me? There is no one computer program. We use all kinds of activities. We're very open to it. The choice of activity is based on what the person needs, what their learning style is, and what is available to use. Okay? The bridging groups are a time when there are lots of discussions, and these are some of the focuses, the foci of the groups: metacognition, skill building, education, and how to help people use their cognition in a social context. The programs, I've been involved in bringing it to large systems of care that might serve, thousands of people, and then also to very small systems of care. And in New York City, the Libra Recovery Clinic is a very small clinic, which is sort of the flagship site for where we try out lots of ideas. I'd say in terms of the large systems of care, the New York State Project and in Japan are examples of that. I'm going to skip over this one just in the interest of time because we talked about it. Those large-scale projects have given us an opportunity to look at what happens, and typically if we train 100 people, about 70% of them will go on to set up programs. Of these programs that get set up, over 60% of them can keep their fill level at greater than 80%. 70% of the time, on average, people are showing up to their sessions, and clinicians are able to do the treatment with about 80% fidelity. This is an example of program evaluation, which I think is extremely important. This was asking clinicians at 8 clinics For your people who are involved in cognitive remediation, do you see any change in how they're functioning in the clinic? And I find it really interesting to hear what people are saying. You can see here that the largest area, they said 63% of the participants improved in their self-confidence. That's something they saw. And we also asked people, what about outside of the clinic? What do you see as the impact? What I find interesting about this is to hear what it is that matters and what people are observing, and to hear the language they use when describing the effects of cognitive remediation. So here, in terms of community engagement, what clinicians would say is, well, they're doing more in the community, they're out there more, or they're socializing, they're working. These are examples of how we do program evaluation. The clients themselves, over 90% of them will say that if they liked the treatment, they thought it was helpful to them in terms of their cognition and functioning. I've spent a lot of time developing training resources, but I'm not going to focus on that. What I wanted to focus on, because I know we're at the end soon, is that any cognitive remediation program, it's really important that it be nimble, and that the reason we do program evaluation is so that we can constantly be changing to adjust to the changing demands of society and what's available to us. So we practice, we collect data, we use that information to then change our practice. And I think that's a very important cycle that needs to happen. And that whatever cognitive remediation approach one uses, that one be very responsive, okay? And in my work, sort of examples of that are that there's constant interaction with the clinicians, or we're always bringing in information from the research to adjust the approach. I'm going to skip over this and just sum up by saying that cognitive remediation is one specific service to address cognitive health. Motivation is extremely important if we want to be affecting a change. That cognitive remediation is a recovery-oriented service, and that program evaluation helps us be nimble, responding to changes in the social and healthcare environment. So thank you very much.